I saw my wife kiss her boss at the company's special party, so I handed her the divorce decree right there, amid toasts and forced smiles. She tried to hide her shock, but I no longer needed an explanation. I left with my head held high and certain that I deserved better. In the days that followed, she discovered that her boss never had plans beyond that night, and was left alone, lost in regret and silence. I slowly rebuilt my life and found a new love, someone who offers me respect, complicity, and peace. One day, she wrote to me asking for forgiveness. I responded with a light heart, "I've already forgiven you, but we've gone our separate ways. Because love may end, but dignity endures." It happened in less than 30 seconds. The kiss. The split second between the shock and my heart being ripped from my chest. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the murder of years of trust, the silent destruction of everything we built together with small routines, invisible gestures, and wordless promises. The room was still bathed in golden lights and clinking glasses. They didn't notice me. She smiled at him with that gentle gleam in her eyes, the same one that used to be only mine. I didn't cry. I simply opened the folder I'd been carrying and handed her the letter. She took it as if it were another toast of the evening, and when she realized what it was, her eyes froze for a few seconds, as if time had folded in on itself. There was no scandal, no shouting, no drama. Just silence. The kind of silence that screams. She followed me with her eyes as I left. She tried to move, but couldn't. Perhaps the fear of public humiliation paralyzed her, perhaps it was her conscience beginning to weigh on her, but I kept going, one step at a time, moving through that elegant, empty crowd with the dignity of someone who has lost everything but still has themselves. And in that moment, when the door closed behind me, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Because sometimes, the greatest pain comes from holding on to someone who let go of you long ago. In the days that followed, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The silverware in the drainer, the smell of coffee in the morning, the absence of her heels in the hallway. It was as if the world was getting used to the absence of her around me, and I, too. Little by little, anger turned to silence. Silence turned to reflection. And reflection turned to learning. I discovered, day after day, how much I had let myself disappear in that relationship. How much I tolerated in the name of love, how much I kept silent to maintain the peace. How much I diminished myself so she could shine. And all of this, to be exchanged for a kiss in the middle of a party. I learned from mutual friends that her boss never contacted her after the party. Perhaps she thought she was trading marriage for a new story, a fresh start. But what she found was a closed door and an absence greater than mine. He, with more to lose, preferred silence. She, with less to offer, was left with emptiness. She tried to get closer. She called, texted, even sent flowers. I read everything, but didn't respond. Not out of revenge. But because my answer had already been given, in that ballroom, with that letter. Too late. And that's when I began to relearn how to live. Little by little, I rediscovered my forgotten self. I rediscovered the pleasure of simple things. Laughter without guilt. The freedom of not constantly wondering if I'm enough. I met someone. Someone who doesn't make me feel like I'm fighting alone. Who doesn't measure love with neediness, who doesn't weigh gestures, who doesn't demand presence with absences. For the first time in years, I felt exactly where I was supposed to be. Meanwhile, she began to appear in the places we frequented. In the same cafe where we drank coffee on Sundays, in the same square where I used to read while she video chatted with her friends. In the same supermarket where we always bought her favorite wine. I pretended not to notice. But I did. She'd pass by, pretending to be distracted, and let her gaze linger for a few seconds, hoping perhaps I'd notice her, that something in me would still vibrate with her presence. But I'd already moved on. And when love truly ends, it doesn't scream. It just goes silent and never comes back. One day, I sat on a bench in the square. It was late afternoon. The sun touched the trees with that late summer orange hue. I was reading, as before. And she was there. Sitting a few feet away. Alone. Her eyes fixed on the ground, as if searching the concrete for some answer. Our eyes met. And she smiled. A small, restrained, shy smile. I smiled back. Not with hate, nor with anger. But with peace. A peace she no longer knew. And in that moment, I understood everything. Love isn't lost in a moment. It dies slowly, in the silences that linger, in the absences that become routine, in the words left unsaid for fear of conflict. She didn't betray me that night. She betrayed me long before. And I betrayed myself too, when I accepted less than I deserved for fear of being alone. Weeks later, I received a letter. Handwritten. In it, she said she understood everything. That she'd traded certainty for uncertainty. That she'd mistaken admiration for desire. That she thought she was alive, when in fact she was just losing herself. She asked for forgiveness. Not to get back together, but because she needed to get the weight of guilt off her chest. I finished reading it, sealed the envelope, and took a deep breath. I grabbed a pen, wrote just one line, and sent it back. I've already forgiven you. But we've gone our separate ways. There were no more attempts. Neither hers nor mine. Life went on. But sometimes, I still see her around. In the same places, on the same corners. Always alone. Always waiting for time to return. But time doesn't. And absence, once planted, grows. It tries to revive something that no longer exists. Like a song that once made sense, but now only plays as noise. Like a memory that no longer hurts, but also doesn't warm. Because when you betray a true love, you don't just lose the other person, you lose yourself. Her story is now made of cold coffee, unsent messages, and paths that lead nowhere. Mine is made of new beginnings, of presence, of quiet love. A love that doesn't need to scream to be felt. A love that, precisely because it comes after the pain, was able to heal. But there was a moment, a single moment, when everything could have been different. A gesture, a choice, a word. Something that, if it had happened sooner, might have changed everything. And that's where the Real story begins, in that decisive moment where what's lost is so much more than a marriage. It's where you lose the chance to love again, the right way. What happened between that kiss and the silence that followed, is something neither she nor I will ever forget. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but built on real emotions to clearly show how betrayal destroys relationships, hearts, and entire lives. Get ready now for an intense story, full of twists and turns, raw feelings, and a lesson that will mark you deeply. Take a deep breath, and be ready to listen to a shocking story. Ethan and Claire met on a random late afternoon, without any special announcement or cinematic foreshadowing. It was one of those banal coincidences that only gain importance with the passing of time. He was leaving a bookstore, 3 books in hand, his mind wandering. She was rushing in, looking for a last-minute gift for her sister. They bumped into each other. The books fell. Their eyes met. And there was silence for a few seconds, one of those silences that speaks more than any words. He smiled first, with that shyness he'd carried in his eyes since childhood. She smiled back, her phone already vibrating inside her bag, the world screaming at her to move on. But in that moment, neither of them was in a hurry. And that's how it all began, simple, ordinary, real. Claire was the kind of woman who always seemed to know what she was doing. Confident, organized, with a practical sense that made everything around her easier. She worked as an event coordinator for a mid-sized company and always knew how to balance her career with her personal life. He had charm, presence, and an almost magical ability to enter a room and reorganize it with a discreet touch. Ethan, on the other hand, was a civil engineer, more introspective, careful with his words, one of those men who observe before acting. He had a refined sense of humor, a calm that was present even in the most difficult situations, and a delicacy that was uncommon. The two formed a contrast that worked. While she was the spark, he was the breeze. While she was enchanted by the new, he relished the comfort of the familiar. They started dating a few weeks after their first date. Everything followed a natural rhythm. It wasn't an overwhelming passion that consumed them immediately, but rather a growing, consistent affection, built with patience and presence. Simple dinners at home on Saturdays, long conversations in the car after work, weekends in the park, trips planned months in advance. They laughed a lot together. And, most of all, they listened to each other. Ethan loved watching Claire talk about her projects, gesturing enthusiastically, her eyes sparkling with new ideas. Claire found in him a safe foundation, someone with whom she could share her insecurities without fear of judgment. The wedding came 2 years later. The ceremony was small, attended by just close friends and family. They chose personalized vows, and while neither was overly romantic, they were moved by the promise to continue choosing each other, even through the difficult times. They slowly built their lives. They bought a house with a backyard, planted a tree together, argued about the colors of the living room walls and which side of the bed each preferred. It was details like these that filled their daily lives, that gave meaning to the years. Sometimes they disagreed, of course. Claire was more direct, wanting to resolve everything in the moment. Ethan, more reflective, preferred silence as a way of dealing with conflicts. But they always found a middle ground. This was part of the silent pact they had made, to stay close even when emotions threatened to drive them apart. Over time, things stabilized, perhaps too much so. The once comfortable routine began to feel predictable. Dinners gave way to quick meals in front of the television. Long conversations became short and practical, focused on bills, deadlines, and responsibilities. Claire, ambitious by nature, began dedicating herself increasingly to work. She took on new projects, extended her hours, and began traveling frequently. Ethan was always supportive. He never opposed her ambitions. On the contrary, he was proud to see her growing. But there were nights when he would sit at the table with 2 plates ready and only one place occupied. On those nights, he didn't complain. He just glanced at the clock, ate in silence, and left a loving note on the fridge. The emotional distance didn't come all at once. It crept in gradually, amid postponed appointments and forgotten hugs. Claire began forgetting important dates, or only remembering them at the last minute. Ethan, for his part, began to bottle up his frustrations, avoiding confrontation. Neither of them seemed to notice, or perhaps they preferred to pretend they didn't. After all, they had a structured life, stability, a carefully crafted history. And that, in itself, seemed worth more than any momentary discomfort. But love, though strong, doesn't survive on structure alone. It requires presence. And there were times when, even though they were in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, they felt worlds apart, separated by invisible walls. Despite this, there was still affection. There was affection in the most automatic gestures, like when he made her coffee before he left or when she left a clean towel folded for him in the bathroom. They were small gestures, but real. And that was what they both relied on to keep going. Claire was still enchanted by the way Ethan spoke to his nephews or the way he smiled reading old newspapers on Sundays. Ethan still found the bad jokes she told to relieve stress funny. There was, indeed, love there. But a love that needed oxygen, attention, and reconnection. Social life had also changed. Dinners with friends became more sporadic. Outings as a couple were limited to corporate events, obligatory get-togethers, where one viewed the other as part of a composition rather than as an intimate partner. The exchange of knowing glances diminished. Kisses became less frequent. And when they did come, they sometimes felt like mere formality. Claire, constantly immersed in a fast-paced dynamic, began to feel something was missing. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the lack of time, maybe it was the weight of so many expectations, maybe it was just fatigue. Ethan, noticing, tried to reach out. He planned a short trip for the two of them, thought about a special dinner at home, bought a book she'd mentioned months earlier. But the gestures seemed to no longer reach the depth they once did. Even so, he persisted. Because he still believed it was possible to rescue her. Because he still saw in her the woman he wanted to share his life with. Because, deep down, he couldn't live any other way. Claire, on the other hand, felt increasingly torn. She wanted to reconnect, but she no longer knew where. Routine was swallowing her up, and something inside her was beginning to yearn for a different kind of emotion. It wasn't a lack of love. It was the unconscious search for something that would make her feel alive again. Something that would break the linearity, that would take her out of that tepid state in which the days were repeating themselves. Her heart, once so connected to his, began to drift with thoughts she didn't understand. Ethan noticed the change, but he preferred to deceive himself. He told himself it was just a phase. That everything would fall into place. That their love was strong enough to withstand the pressure of the days. And maybe it was. Maybe there was still time. But time, that relentless old man, waits for no one who is indecisive. And while he believed it was enough to be there, firm, present, constant, Claire looked at her own image in the mirror and no longer recognized herself. Not for lack of love for him. But for an inner feeling that she had lost herself. They still laughed sometimes. They still slept side by side. They still made plans, however small. But something in the air had changed. A kind of disconnection difficult to explain, which was neither absence nor presence, it was simply a void where once there had been intensity. And it was in this silent atmosphere that their story began to unfold in directions neither of them imagined. There was still no betrayal, still no rupture. But the ground was already cracked, the air thin, their gazes no longer the same light. On the surface, they seemed like the perfect couple. Friends commented on their chemistry, family admired their partnership. And they smiled, waved, and thanked each other. But only they knew about the long pauses in conversation, the weight of silence before bed, the difficulty of finding something to talk about at Sunday morning coffee. Only they knew how much they missed each other even though they were side by side. And at that point in history, that was exactly what defined them, two hearts bound by a past too strong to ignore, but also wounded by a present too lukewarm to live with enthusiasm. There was still time. Perhaps there was still time. But only time could tell how far love could endure silence. And it is in this silence that the real story begins. Claire stared at herself in the mirror with a weariness that wasn't physical. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there months before, a quiet restlessness, a constant doubt, a kind of absence present even in her most automatic gestures. It was as if the woman who always had all the answers was slowly losing herself in the questions she avoided asking. Ethan was still there, with the same gentle routine, the same caring gestures, the same firm, steady presence he'd always offered. But that was precisely what confused her most. He hadn't done anything wrong. And perhaps because of that, guilt was beginning to grow inside her like a deep, silent root. The days began to feel heavier. Meetings took on longer proportions. Work nights stretched out unnecessarily. Claire began accepting invitations to corporate events even when she could have declined. She found excuses to leave the house, to extend her time away, to postpone her return. And deep down, she knew she was searching for something. It wasn't passion, nor uncontrolled desire, nor a reckless fling. It was simply the desire to feel seen again, to feel desired by those who don't know her well enough to see her flaws, to relive the feeling of newness that marriage inevitably loses over time. It was in this space of emotional rifts that he emerged. Marcus was one of the company's oldest directors. Charismatic, experienced, accustomed to moving naturally through the corridors of power. He had a quick word, ready compliments, a slight arrogance disguised as confidence. And Claire, even though she was aware of everything, began to allow herself small approaches. At first, small talk, jokes during coffee breaks, subtle compliments about her work. Then came informal lunches, coffees outside the building, texts after hours. All camouflaged under the guise of professionalism, of harmless closeness between colleagues. But behind the harmless appearance, she felt butterflies in her stomach she hadn't felt in a long time. And that was enough for her conscience to begin to fail. Ethan couldn't quite grasp what was happening, but he could feel it. There was a difference in their good morning kisses, a forced lightness in her voice, a distance that wasn't physical, but emotional. He'd ask if everything was okay. She'd say yes. And he'd believe her, or convince himself that believing was easier than facing the possibility of a growing rift between them. Even so, he kept trying. He'd cook for her, send her loving messages, try to start deeper conversations. But she was always in a hurry, always tired, always needing to finish something for tomorrow. The invitation to the company party arrived like every other year. A formal event where employees celebrated results and growth. Claire hesitated to invite Ethan. She considered going alone, justifying it as a networking event and that he would feel out of place. But he insisted. He said he wanted to go, that it had been a while since they'd been out together, that he missed being close outside of their routine. She agreed, albeit with a certain internal resistance she couldn't explain. When the night arrived, Claire looked stunning. She wore a long dark blue dress that enhanced her elegance and applied her makeup delicately. Ethan, seeing her ready, smiled with a twinkle in his eye. And for a brief moment, she almost remembered what it was like to lose herself in that gaze. The party was held in a luxurious ballroom decorated with yellow lights and white flower arrangements. There was background music, discreet waiters, and glasses of sparkling wine circulated everywhere. Claire was restless, checking her phone frequently, and Ethan, even trying to hide it, could sense her anxiety. Upon arrival, they were greeted cordially by their colleagues and soon dispersed into separate conversations. Claire went to greet the directors, while Ethan stood near the bar, observing from a distance. He saw her smiling, gesturing, charming everyone around her. She had always been like that. She had this sparkle, this ability to stand out in any setting. What he didn't expect was the scene that followed. For a moment, his eyes lost her in the crowd. He walked a few steps, dodging groups of people chatting, until he saw her across the room. Claire was with Marcus. Too close. The kind of closeness that can't be justified by protocol. Ethan stopped. His eyes fixed. His body still. He saw the subtle touch on his arm, the tilted smile, the lingering gaze. And then, he saw the kiss. Not a technical, accidental, or confused kiss. But a kiss full of intention, even if brief. A kiss that, in itself, crumbled everything that had once been built. He didn't react immediately. He stood there, frozen, as if time had frozen around him. The sounds of the party became muffled, as if he were underwater. The faces around him blurred. He felt his heart slowing, as if trying to process information his body refused to accept. And at the same time, a brutal clarity washed over him. The confirmation of a feeling he'd been ignoring. The realization that, even without meaning to, she'd been gone for a long time. Ethan turned and walked to where he'd left the folder with his work documents. He pulled out the envelope he'd prepared weeks earlier, not out of suspicion, but because of a conversation he'd planned to have with her about the future of their relationship. He'd signed the papers as a precaution, never imagining he'd have to use them so soon. He walked over to her, who was still talking to Marcus. She saw him approaching and smiled, perhaps reflexively. He held out the envelope. Claire took it, uncomprehending. She opened it. She read it. And her smile froze. She said nothing. She just stared at him, wide-eyed, still trying to maintain her composure in front of the colleagues around her. Ethan, with an almost cruel serenity, simply said he felt there was nothing more to talk about. And, turning, he left. He didn't quicken his steps, didn't cry, didn't tremble. He simply left. And it was there, amid toasts, soft lights, and glasses raised in celebration, that their story reached the point of no return. Claire stood there, envelope in hand, her throat dry. Marcus tried to hide it, slowly walking away, leaving her alone in the crowd. Her eyes roamed the room as if searching for something to hold on to. But all she found was emptiness. That night, nothing seemed crueler than his absence by her side when she arrived home. The place seemed bigger, colder, quieter. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt a kind of loneliness that can't be resolved with words or the presence of others. It was the absence of something lost forever. But what Claire didn't yet know, what she hadn't even suspected, was that that kiss wouldn't be the worst part of their story. There was something more. Something that, when revealed, would change not only how she viewed her own mistake, but how she viewed their entire story. And that something was about to be revealed. Claire spent the next few days as if floating inside a never-ending nightmare, trying to maintain her routine, trying to pretend she had a control she knew deep down she had lost. She avoided mirrors, avoided the places where she usually spent time with him, avoided even the sound of her own breathing, as if each exhale were further confirmation that everything was truly falling apart. At work, the stares began to weigh heavily. The whispers in the hallways she had previously pretended not to hear now became evident. Marcus withdrew in a cowardly and predictable way. He didn't check in on her, didn't call, didn't even text. He returned to his usual cold and distant demeanor, and the only thing Claire received from him now was silence. A silence that seemed to mock every wrong decision she had made. But nothing hurt as much as Ethan's absence. He didn't block her. He didn't pursue her. He didn't argue. He simply disappeared from her life with the grace he always had, silently. Claire tried to mentally reconstruct every moment of the last few months, every avoided conversation, every ignored gesture. And the more she thought, the more she understood that it wasn't just the betrayal that destroyed what they had. It was the sum of small absences, of distances built in silence, of choices that seemed harmless but, in the end, proved fatal. She felt like someone who threw away a diamond because it was covered in dust. She decided to write a letter. Not to win him back, but because she needed to say it. The words flowed like a belated confession. She spoke of guilt, regret, and longing. She said she expected nothing in return, that she just wanted him to know she now understood the extent of what she had lost. She posted the letter with trembling hands, feeling as though she had deposited the last shred of hope she still held. And then she began to wait. But the reply, when it came, was as short as it was definitive: "I've already forgiven you. But we've gone our separate ways." Claire read that sentence dozens of times, searching between the lines for some sign that there was still a chance, some space between the words where she could cling. But all she found was the rawness of a period. Even so, she began to frequent the places they used to go. The corner cafe, the flower stand, the park bench where he read on Sundays. She would sit there alone, watching the couples pass by, hoping to see him. Some days, he would appear. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman beside him. A light, smiling, simple presence. Claire watched from a distance, feeling her heart sink in a way she could barely describe. It was like watching a film she'd written herself, but where the lead had been replaced without warning. And the cruelest thing of all was seeing that he seemed happier. Not in the theatrical, exaggerated sense. But truly happy. Peaceful. At peace. Time passed, but the pain inside her wouldn't subside. And then, one afternoon when she'd given up on waiting, fate turned cruel. She was leaving the market, and as she turned the corner, she saw him. Ethan. Alone. Standing in front of a bookstore. The same place where it all began. Claire hesitated, but something inside her pushed her. She walked toward him, her heart racing, unsure of what to say. When he saw her, he didn't smile. But he didn't shy away either. He just looked at her calmly, like someone facing something that no longer hurts. She asked if they could talk. He said yes. They walked to a quiet cafe nearby. They sat across from each other like two strangers who had once been everything. Claire spoke first. She said she knew there was no justification, that she didn't want to rewrite anything, but that she needed to understand how he had managed to move on so quickly. Ethan took a deep breath. He looked at her with a mixture of compassion and still smoldering pain. He said it hadn't been quick. That he'd spent sleepless nights wondering where he'd gone wrong. That he'd felt anger, yes, but also sadness. And that what saved him was not harboring ghosts. That he'd decided not to let pain define who he was. And that, most importantly, he'd found peace in accepting that not all love survives a lack of care. Claire clutched the cup in her hands, trying to keep herself together. And that's when he said something that completely destabilized her. That the betrayal hurt, of course, but what truly destroyed something inside him was something she perhaps couldn't even imagine. She told him that, weeks before the party, she'd received a message from a mutual friend. A photo. Nothing explicit. Just a picture of her and Marcus leaving a restaurant together, apparently in an intimate mood. He didn't confront her during the season. He preferred to believe it was just work. That it was just coincidence. But in that moment, I knew something wasn't right. Claire tried to deny it, but there was no more room for lies. And then, her voice wavering, she asked if he hated her. Ethan smiled lightly and said no. That the love he felt for her was too genuine to turn to hate. But that love had already died. That forgiveness was the way he found to not carry her weight on his shoulders. Claire lowered her eyes, holding back tears. She felt as if she'd been erased from the story of her own life. As if everything they'd experienced had been buried by her thoughtless choices. Before they said goodbye, she wanted to know more about the woman who now walked beside him. Ethan hesitated, then said she was someone who appeared when he no longer looked for her. Who came without promises, without haste, without demands. Someone who looked at him in a way he hadn't been looked at in a long time. Claire simply nodded. There was nothing more to say. They stood, and when she extended her hand to say goodbye, he hugged her. A silent hug, without rancor, without desire, without any intention of returning. Just a gesture of closure. But it was when she got home that Claire saw what would truly shatter something inside her. A notification on her phone. It was a post from a mutual friend. A photo. Ethan, holding hands with his new wife, in front of the house where he and Claire had lived for years. The caption read, "A new beginning. Where home has always been." And then, the detail that made the ground disappear, beside them, a little girl with clear eyes and a wide smile. She wasn't his daughter by birth, but she called Ethan, father, with the naturalness of someone who truly loves her. Claire knew that child. She was the daughter of his new partner, the product of a previous relationship. And she knew, then and there, that he had built a new family, not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because he had finally found a place where love was light. That was the real secret. The real breaking point. It wasn't just that she'd betrayed him. It was what he found afterward. A love so sincere, so peaceful, so deeply real, that it further exposed the superficiality of what she'd sought in Marcus. He'd moved on, yes. But not by running away from her. Rather, by walking toward what she couldn't offer. And that's when Claire understood. That the betrayal hadn't just stolen her marriage. It had stolen the chance to be for him what another woman was today. It had stolen the future she once held in her hands. And that late afternoon, alone on the sofa in the living room where they once shared dreams, Claire cried like someone finally accepting that she lost not only a love, but herself. Because when regret arrives too late, it doesn't redeem. It just silences. That night, after seeing the photo, Claire sat for hours on the living room floor, surrounded by silence and the memory of every detail she'd ever shared with Ethan in that very space. The rug was still the same, the pillows they'd chosen together, the lamp he'd fixed one Sunday morning while she was making pancakes. Everything there seemed frozen in time, except her. Because inside her, everything was crumbling like a castle built on quicksand. It wasn't just the pain of loss, nor even the deep regret of betrayal. It was the emptiness that comes when you realize someone has rebuilt a new story on the rubble of the one that was destroyed. And that this new story has more color, more life, more truth than everything she once believed was enough. Weeks passed since that encounter. Claire tried to rebuild herself in different ways. She signed up for yoga classes, went back to therapy, reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with. But nothing filled the hole she now felt inside. And though she tried to move on, every corner of the city seemed to bring her thoughts back to Ethan. His face returned in strangers on the subway, in the smells wafting from the street, in the songs playing randomly. And when she least expected it, the memory of that little girl smiling beside him came like a punch to the gut. She couldn't get the child's gaze out of her head. There was something there that hurt her more than any scene of a happy couple. It was the recognition that he had not only moved on, but had become essential to another little life, and that was something she could never touch again. It was one cloudy morning, while mindlessly flipping through a magazine at the coffee shop where she and Ethan often hung out, that Claire received an unexpected message. It was from his mother. A short, direct, but kind text. He said he would be moving to another state the following month and would like to see her one last time, if Claire felt comfortable. The invitation sank like a stone in her heart. She had avoided all contact with his family since their separation. She knew she had disappointed not only Ethan, but everyone around him. Still, something compelled her to accept. Perhaps the need to hear some words that would help her understand what still hurt so much. They met in the late afternoon, in the garden of the house where Ethan had grown up. The woman was as she remembered, serene, soft-spoken, with a gaze that seemed to pierce any attempt at disguise. Claire didn't try to be a nuisance. They sat under the shade of an ancient tree and, for a few minutes, simply listened to the sound of the branches swaying in the wind. Ethan's mother spoke first. She said she wasn't there to judge, that she knew life was made of choices, and that sometimes we make mistakes trying to get things right. Claire simply listened, her eyes welling. And then she heard something she hadn't expected. That Ethan had cried for the first time in his adult life, sitting on that very bench, just a few days after leaving home. That he didn't want to talk to anyone, that he just wanted silence. But it was there, in that silence, that he decided not to carry the hurt, because he had understood that love cannot be sustained alone. Claire didn't know how to respond. She just let the tears flow. She asked, in a whisper, if he seemed happy now. And his mother responded with the certainty of someone who's seen her son reborn. She said his smile was light again, that the presence of his new partner and her daughter brought a different sparkle to his eyes, a tranquility she'd never seen before. And that, although there was true love between Claire and Ethan, their time had passed. That there's no way to repair a glass once it's shattered. You can pick up the pieces, but it will never be the same. That night, Claire returned home and stared at her reflection in the mirror for long minutes. She began to understand, for the first time, that perhaps it wasn't about trying to win Ethan back, but about dealing with what she had done to herself. She hadn't just betrayed the man she loved, she had betrayed herself. She had traded depth for illusion, exchanged stability for empty excitement, exchanged truth for vanity. And the worst punishment wasn't losing him, but losing the woman she was when she was with him. That version of herself who knew how to love, who knew how to care, who took pride in her own choices. Months passed. She didn't see him anymore. She no longer sought out the same places. She stopped feeding on what little remained of their memory. She slowly began to write a new life. She moved house. She changed her routine. She tried to give meaning to her days with a purpose that was hers alone. But every now and then, especially on sunny Sundays, she felt a piercing longing for something that could no longer be touched. It wasn't longing for him, but for the feeling of being loved as she was. Of belonging. Of knowing that, even in the silences, there was someone there, on the other side of the sofa, living life with her. The final reunion happened unexpectedly, like everything that truly matters in life. It was a random afternoon, in a park on the other side of town, where Claire went for a walk to clear her head. She was distracted with her headphones on when she saw a familiar figure in the distance. She stopped. It was Ethan, sitting on the grass, with the little girl by his side and his new companion reading a book at the foot of a tree. He was laughing at something the girl was saying, playing with her hands with a lightness that made him almost a different man. Claire hesitated, turned her face away, considered leaving. But then, on impulse, she approached. He saw her first. He stood up slowly, not with discomfort, but with respect. She simply said, "Hi," and he responded with a restrained smile. His new companion also stood up and gently took the child's hand and stepped away, giving him space. Claire thanked him with a look. Then, facing him, she said what she had never had the courage to say. That she now understood. That true love is not begged for, not betrayed, not forgotten out of vanity. That she didn't expect forgiveness, because he had already given her that, but she wanted to thank him. For being true love. For showing her, even after the end, that it is possible to start over. Ethan listened attentively. He said he wished her peace. That she deserved it. And that he hoped that, one day, she would look at herself with tenderness again. She thanked him. She smiled sadly, but gratefully. And as she turned to leave, she heard the little girl ask softly, "Who was that, Daddy?" Ethan answered without hesitation, his voice calm, "Someone who was once part of my story." Claire didn't look back. But hearing those words, she felt a sharp, deep, definitive pain. She was no longer part of his story. And in that moment, she understood the true meaning of losing someone forever. Because losing someone isn't always about seeing them leave. Sometimes, it's about seeing them move on, without you. Claire left the park as if something had definitively ended inside her, not with a bang, not with screams or laments, but with the brutal serenity of a chapter closing with an undeniable final point. She walked the streets as if the world around her were more distant, more silent, almost unreal. The air seemed denser, each step required more effort, as if her body now carried the symbolic weight of a truth impossible to ignore. There were no more illusions, fantasies, hypotheses. She was no longer a character in a story of reconquest, not the woman hoping for a second chance, not even a living memory. She was just past. A fragmented memory. A name that remained somewhere between yesterday and never again. And acknowledging this didn't bring relief. It brought a new kind of pain, deeper, more resigned, a pain that demands no escape because it understands that certain wounds should not be healed in a hurry. Over the next few days, Claire faced the silence of her own life with a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Solitude ceased to be circumstantial and became companionship. Routines continued, but their meanings changed. Breakfast took longer, not for pleasure, but because nothing else could hurry her. Nights, once filled with notifications, were now filled with slow reading, old songs, and memories that came without asking permission. Sometimes she laughed alone when remembering something silly, sometimes she cried in the middle of a song that wasn't even special. Her mind played tricks. It brought back phrases that had never been answered, questions that had never been asked. What if I had said that? What if I had gone back that night? But she knew. There was no point dwelling on possibilities anymore. What had already been done had shaped the present. And this was the present, living with the knowledge that she had authored her own downfall. From that point on, the world around her was no longer the same. Her friends, though present, no longer knew how to position themselves. Some subtly distanced themselves, as if avoiding being too close to the shadow of another's pain. Others, even well-intentioned, talked too much, suggesting distractions, encounters, new experiences, as if the emptiness she felt could be filled with superficialities. But Claire didn't blame anyone. She understood that there are pains that only make sense within the person experiencing them. And that trying to explain them to others is like handing them a book with blank pages and expecting them to read your story. It was one of those days, between tasks, that she decided to start writing again. Not professionally, not to show anyone. Just for herself. She grabbed an old notebook and began to write down everything that came to her mind, without filters, without order, without purpose. And there, in the act of writing, she rediscovered a forgotten part of herself. Words came as if escaping from a prison, sentences formed with the urgency of someone who needs to exist. He wrote about pain, yes, but also about the things he learned. About how silence can be crueler than an argument. About how time, when mismanaged, corrodes everything. About how love demands conscious choices every day. And, most importantly, about how a lack of constant care turns the strongest love to dust. These writings gradually began to take shape. First as diaries, then as chronicles. She didn't show them to anyone, but writing became essential. It was there that she processed everything. Each written line was an attempt to understand why she had made the choices she had. And the more she wrote, the more she realized that what had led her to betrayal wasn't just desire or need. It was an existential void that had existed for a long time, a flaw in her identity, a need for approval she hadn't been able to name. She had betrayed Ethan, yes. But before that, she had betrayed herself by moving away from who she was, by losing herself in the expectations of others, by forgetting that a relationship shouldn't be a haven for unresolved insecurities. In this process of internal reconstruction, she also began to understand the nature of the love she had with him. It wasn't a fairy tale love, it wasn't perfect, but it was whole. And she didn't know how to take care of it. She began to observe the couples around her with different eyes. She saw how easy it is to get lost in routine, how common it is to trade depth for distraction, how almost automatic it is to get used to someone's presence and stop seeing how rare it is to have someone who stays even when everything seems monotonous. And all of this always led her to the same conclusion: love doesn't fail on its own, it dies, suffocated by a lack of attention, by absence disguised as presence, by choices not made when there was still time. Amidst all this, Claire began to experience a kind of moral dilemma. On the one hand, she knew she needed to forgive herself, that continuing to punish herself wouldn't turn back the clock. But on the other, each step toward healing felt like a betrayal of the pain she'd caused. How could she move forward without seeming to erase the gravity of what she'd done? How could she start over without diminishing the impact she'd had on the life of someone who offered nothing but love? She found herself reflecting on this during solitary walks, while writing, while staring out the window at night. There was a feeling of guilt that didn't demand punishment, but rather recognition. As if, to move forward, she first needed to accept that the mistake didn't define her, but also couldn't be forgotten. It was in this context that an unexpected proposal arose. An old friend who had read some of Claire's writings, after finding them in a forgotten notebook, suggested she turn them into a book. The idea frightened her at first. Exposing her story, even if veiled, seemed unnecessary. But then she reflected. Perhaps this was the only way to make something meaningful out of all the pain she'd experienced. To transform what had previously been destruction into learning. And so she began rewriting the texts more carefully, structuring the chapters, connecting feelings to actions, and drawing the characters honestly. She didn't try to protect herself or justify herself. She simply recounted, in depth, what it's like to lose someone through bad choices. What it's like to truly love, but fail anyway. And how, after all this, it's still possible to find some kind of personal redemption, even if the love has already gone elsewhere. The book process took months, and during that time, something shifted inside her. Words became catharsis. The memories, though still painful, were no longer open wounds. They were scars. And scars, unlike wounds, don't hurt when touched. They simply remind her that something was experienced. She began to see Ethan as a character in her own story. Someone she loved, someone she lost, but who also taught her more than anyone else. And this made her accept, with humility, that some loves come not to last, but to teach us who we truly are. When the book was finished, she didn't expect much feedback. But to her surprise, the publisher who read the manuscript decided to publish it. And the work, despite its understated nature, found readers. People who had also made mistakes, who had also lost, who also needed to understand that regret isn't the end of the road, but the beginning of a new consciousness. And there, through those pages, Claire found a new purpose. She began to speak about vulnerability, about choices, about how love requires courage to be nurtured every day. But despite everything, he never tried to find Ethan again. He knew that their story, though marked by pain, also ended with dignity. He had moved on, rebuilt, and become a father to someone who chose him with her heart. And she, now, had also found her place in the world. A place of learning, of inner peace, of acceptance. And although longing still haunted her, it was no longer a longing that begged for return. It was a longing I was grateful existed. It was one random night, after a lecture about her book, that Claire received an unexpected message. A simple, "I read your book. Thank you for putting into words what I could never say." There was no signature, but she knew who it was. She smiled silently, feeling her heart beat calmly, without despair, without anguish. Because in that moment, she understood that she had closed the cycle. That she no longer owed anything to anyone, not even herself. And that, finally, she was ready for whatever came next. Time passed with the slowness typical of internal transformations that don't scream, but simply impose themselves, little by little, in the silence of ordinary days. Claire's life continued at a more serene, but no less intense, tone. The book had brought a new wave of meaning, and with it, a different kind of responsibility, that of constantly facing the repercussions of her own exposed truths. In each lecture, each event, each message from an emotional reader, she relived passages of what she had experienced, felt once again the pain woven into the words, and recognized how much of herself still existed between the lines. There was no regret, nor pride, but an almost mature, almost wise acceptance. Almost. Because, deep down, some wounds, even when closed, still itch on rainy days. After Ethan's message, Claire didn't know how to react for days. She read and reread those few words, searching for some echo that would justify a return, a response, a new dialogue. But the more she reread, the more she understood, that wasn't an opening. It was a respectful conclusion. It was his way of saying, "I saw, I understood, I respected, not, I want to go back." And even though a part of her felt the urge to reciprocate, she held back the urge. Not out of pride, but out of maturity. She had learned, through effort and pain, that not every gesture needs a response. Some words serve only to seal things, not to start over. And so, she put her phone in the drawer and decided to experience that silence as the most dignified outcome they could have. The seasons changed, and with them came more subtle changes. Claire began teaching writing workshops at a public school near the neighborhood where she grew up. She wanted to give something back, to contribute to the reconstruction of others as someone had once done for her, even if indirectly. In small classes, among teenagers who could barely name what they felt, she found a new way to heal. Seeing those raw, missing, unfinished stories made me understand even more about the journey itself. She realized how much feelings, even if experienced at different times, have universal roots: the fear of rejection, the yearning for belonging, the fragility hidden behind forced smiles. She began to listen more than she spoke. And she learned, once again, that listening to another's pain is like deciphering oneself through a mirror. It was during one of these workshops that she met David. He wasn't a student. He was a history teacher. He helped organize the school's social projects. He had a simple way of speaking, an honest laugh, and eyes that never wavered from emotion. At first, they exchanged only pleasantries, bureaucratic questions about schedules, classrooms, activities. Then came coffee after meetings, chats about books, comfortable silences. David didn't ask too many questions. He wasn't curious about her past. He just looked, attentively, as if he knew there was pain there but didn't need to dig. He listened with his whole body, with his presence. And that, for Claire, was like breathing after so long trapped in deep self-absorption. Still, there was a conflict within her. Part of her wanted to dive into this new encounter, make room, give in. But another part, the more cautious one, feared reliving the cycle of expectations and frustrations. Not for him. But for her. Because now she knew how fragile she was when she put her whole self into something. And she didn't want to be fragile anymore. She wanted to be whole on her own. David seemed to understand this without her saying it. He never pressured. Sometimes he approached, sometimes he retreated, but always with respect. And it was at this gentle, almost patient pace that he gained ground. Not as Ethan's replacement, but as something different. A new kind of affection, one that didn't require comparison. A kind of presence that didn't seek to correct past mistakes, but simply to be there. One cold night, after a school activity, Claire and David walked to the bus stop. She wore a scarf he'd borrowed the week before. The wind cut through her thoughts, and yet, she didn't want the journey to end. They stopped in front of a closed bookstore sign. David looked at her and said, almost in a whisper, that he liked being with her because he didn't have to pretend he was stronger than he was. That with her, he could just be him. Claire smiled, a lump in her throat. She said she feared she no longer knew how to love without fear. He replied that perhaps loving with fear was precisely the bravest thing anyone could do. And in that sentence, she understood that love doesn't have to come with certainties. Sometimes, it just comes with caution. Their closeness intensified, but without urgency. They went out to simple places, exchanged short messages during the day, sat together in silence just to watch the rain fall. There was something comforting about that dynamic. David had read Claire's book, understood the subtext, the pain, the flaws. And yet, he stayed. Not to save her. But to walk alongside her. This, for her, was unprecedented. Love not as salvation, but as companionship. And for the first time in a long time, she felt light. Not because she had forgotten Ethan, but because she had finally understood that memory is not a prison. It is just part of the journey. One afternoon, while organizing her materials for a new workshop, Claire found an old box. Inside were photos, notes, birthday cards. Traces of a time that, though over, still held value. She looked at each item with a kind of affection she hadn't felt in a long time. There was a photo of them in front of their old house. She smiled with her eyes closed, he looked at her as if he believed in everything. She held the image for long seconds. She didn't cry. She just felt. It was gratitude, perhaps. Or simply longing without pain. Then she put everything away again. Not because she didn't want to remember. But because she understood that the life that pulsed now needed space. A month later, during a literary event, Claire was approached by a woman with wavy hair and an intense gaze. She was Ethan's current partner. She happened to be there, accompanying a friend. She said she had read the book, that she knew who Claire was even before she knew what had happened between her and him. There was a respect in her voice, an almost disconcerting elegance. She said that Ethan had mentioned the importance of his past with Claire, without resentment, without accusations. Only with the recognition that that love, even though it had ended, had shaped who he became. Claire listened in silence, feeling a strange peace emerge. There was no jealousy, no tension. Just the unlikely encounter between two women who, in different ways, knew the same man at different stages. Before leaving, the woman said that her little daughter adored Ethan, that she called him, "my calm giant," and that he reciprocated with genuine love, as if she had always been his. Claire smiled, holding back the impact of that comment. The woman thanked him for everything, for the words in the book, for telling a true story, for giving the world a narrative that speaks of human failings, but also of the possibilities of new beginnings. Autumn arrived almost symbolically, with the trees tinting the streets golden and the air growing colder with each morning, as if the outside world silently followed the internal transformations of each person who still carried an open wound or an unfinished love within. For Claire, this period meant more than the changing of the seasons. It was the final cycle of a morning that had been lived in silence, in pages written with pain, in averted glances through streets that once seemed like scenes from her former life. After the last message she received, that single line that said more than entire paragraphs, she never responded again. Not out of pride, nor fear, but because she understood there was nothing more to say. Some messages are goodbyes disguised as gratitude. And she read it like the last page being turned in a book that was too painful to reread, but necessary to understand. The book had gained traction, loyal readers, invitations to events, and even interviews. But none of this filled with false luster what she had learned to recognize as a permanent loss. One night, after yet another literary encounter, Claire found herself alone in a hotel room, staring at her reflection in the window and wondering if she would ever fall in love again. Not with someone new, but with a renewed version of herself. It was strange to admit that, even after all the growth, the recognition, the words that comforted others, there was a loneliness that wouldn't fade. But unlike the loneliness of the past, this one wasn't bitter. It was simply real. Ethan's permanent absence from her life left its mark, but also its spaces. And in those spaces, she began to sow small seeds of possibility. Ethan, for his part, also faced his own ghosts, even within a life that, at first glance, seemed to be in perfect harmony. His new partner, gentle and balanced, had brought him a kind of serene love he'd never known before, but that didn't negate the complexity of what he'd experienced before arriving there. Loving again wasn't easy. Trusting again took effort. Not because of grudges, but because of the invisible wound left by someone who once had every chance to care for him and didn't. He moved on with dignity, built bonds, and was present in the life of the girl he came to call his daughter without anyone needing to teach him how. It was natural. Organic. But every now and then, in the silence of the early morning, he still remembered Claire. Not with longing, but with respect. Like someone remembering a powerful book that, no matter how longed for, will always be an inner reference. There was no more love. There was only memory. And memory, when respected, doesn't bind. It teaches. It was on an ordinary afternoon, while Ethan was waiting for his daughter to leave school, that life decided to make another of its unexpected moves. Claire passed by on the other side of the street, distracted, holding a folder with notes and documents. Their eyes met for a brief moment. They both smiled quietly, respectfully, without the slightest need for closeness. That silent exchange said more than any attempt at dialogue. It wasn't a reunion, nor was it nostalgia. It was simply confirmation of what they both already knew: they had survived their own history. And that, in itself, was victory enough. His current partner's daughter ran up to Ethan, holding a drawing of him standing next to her, a huge heart on top. He bent down, praised the drawing enthusiastically, and hugged her tightly. Claire watched the scene for a few seconds before continuing on her way. And for the first time, seeing that scene that would have previously caused her deep pain, she smiled genuinely. There was no longer room for envy, regret, or throbbing regret. There was only understanding. That child deserved that man. And he deserved that peace. Time passed with the naturalness of someone who doesn't care about what other people feel. And amid subtle changes, entire lives were silently reorganized. Claire released a second book, this time discussing conscious choices and how some pains shouldn't be forgotten, but rather understood as essential parts of the maturation process. Her words resonated with people she'd never met. And she began receiving messages from readers saying that her stories had helped them make decisions, forgive, or even leave. She never got used to it. But she learned to accept that, even when we make terrible mistakes, we can still turn ruins into bridges. Years later, at a university event where she was invited to speak about relationships and emotional decisions, Claire was surprised by a question from the audience. A young woman, with alert eyes and a firm voice, asked if she believed that a mistake defines who we are. Claire was silent for a few seconds before answering. She said that mistakes don't define us, but they accurately show who we were when we weren't ready. She said that judging yourself solely by a mistake is like evaluating an entire story by a poorly written chapter. But yes, you need to look at that chapter honestly. Own it, face it, learn from it. And only then can you write the next ones with more truth. The audience gave a standing ovation. But she knew that speech wasn't for others. It was a letter she was finally able to write to herself. Across town, Ethan was at home, preparing dinner with his girlfriend. The girl, now a little older, told stories about school with the enthusiasm of someone confident in the love that surrounds her. He looked at them both and felt a silent gratitude well up in his chest. There were no longer ghosts in the hallway. There were no longer empty spaces. Everything was now filled with real presence, with simple love, with small gestures. It was no longer about forgetting the past, but about understanding that it was precisely the past that brought him here. And that, however painful it had been, he wouldn't trade anything in the present for any attempt to repeat what once was. As for Marcus, the boss who once charmed Claire with his quick-wittedness and confident presence, he took a different path. Caught up in rumors and internal conflicts within the company, he was eventually removed from his duties and gradually faded from the environment he once dominated. He never sought out Claire again, nor did he take any responsibility for what happened. For him, it was all just another disposable chapter in a life of superficial relationships. But therein lay the difference: he was the kind of person who passes through stories without making a home. While Ethan and Claire were, for a long time, each other's homes. Marcus was just a way station that confused someone hungry for herself. Time, as always, moved on. And it left its mark in subtle wrinkles, changes of address, new loves, and reinvented friendships. But above all, time brought clarity. To everyone. Claire didn't experience a new great love. But she rediscovered love for herself. Ethan didn't forget what he experienced. But he made memory a beacon, not an anchor. And both understood that dignity doesn't come from being right, but from knowing how to get back up after falling. If you've made it this far, tell me what you thought of this story in the comments. Share your opinion, your perspective, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other real stories that show us that love is a daily choice, and that betraying that choice costs dearly. This story teaches us a clear and painful lesson: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It shatters memories, unravels homes, tears invisible bonds, and transforms both the betrayer and the betrayed. No family survives the lack of truth. No love can withstand neglect. And no choice comes without consequences. May this story serve as a reminder to never underestimate the value of someone who chose to stay by your side even when things were difficult. And here we make it clear: this channel does not support any type of betrayal. The stories are fictional, but inspired by human truths. The goal is one: to show the impact of choices and reinforce that respect, loyalty, and truth are the only paths to a love worth living.